What happens when the world's greatest empire begins to crumble from within? Rome, the eternal city, stood for centuries as the heart of power, wealth, and glory. But in the end, it was not just enemies at the gates, it was Rome itself that brought about its fall. This is the story of how the mighty empire collapsed. In the early centuries of the Common Era, Rome seemed unshakable. Stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the misty forests of Britain, the Roman Empire was the largest and most powerful state the Western world had ever seen. Its armies were unmatched, its roads tied continents together, and its laws established order where chaos once reigned. To many, Rome was not just a city or a nation, it was the center of the world, the eternal empire destined to last forever. At its height under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome governed more than 60 million people across vast lands. Its legions enforced peace, its engineers built aqueducts and amphitheaters, and its traders carried spices, silk, and precious metals across continents. The Mediterranean was so dominated by Rome that it was called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Inside the empire, Rome projected grandeur. The Colosseum thundered with spectacles, gladiators fought for glory, and triumphal parades displayed the wealth of conquered peoples. The Roman Senate, though less powerful than in the Republic, still held symbolic importance, giving an air of continuity to traditions that stretched back centuries. To the ordinary citizen, Rome promised security, food distributions, and the pride of belonging to an empire that seemed eternal. Yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks had already begun to appear. The empire's sheer size, once a mark of its strength, became a burden. The vast frontiers stretched thousands of miles, requiring constant vigilance against barbarian raids. Maintaining such a military presence drained the treasury, forcing higher taxes that weighed heavily on peasants and merchants alike. The social fabric of Rome also showed signs of strain. The wealthiest elites lived in opulent villas, controlling vast estates worked by slaves, while ordinary farmers struggled to survive. Discontent grew and loyalty to the empire weakened. Corruption seeped into administration. Governors and tax collectors often lined their own pockets rather than serving the people. Even religion, once a unifying force, became a source of tension. The traditional Roman gods were still worshipped, but the rise of Christianity introduced a new faith that spread rapidly across provinces. At first persecuted, Christians later gained imperial favor, transforming Rome's spiritual identity and fueling cultural shifts. To the outside world, Rome still appeared strong, but the seeds of decline had already been planted. The empire had grown too large to manage, too divided to remain fully united, and too dependent on wealth and conquest to sustain its grandeur. What seemed like small weaknesses would, in time, erode the foundation of the eternal city. The fall of the Roman Empire did not come overnight. It was not a single battle nor one disastrous ruler, but a slow unraveling, political instability, economic troubles, military defeats, and cultural transformations intertwining across centuries. Like a grand statue weathered by time, Rome would not collapse in an instant, but crack piece by piece, until its might gave way to ruin. And so, as we begin this story, we must picture Rome not in ashes but in splendor. For to understand its fall, we must first remember its glory. The empire that once united the known world was about to face challenges it could not overcome. Rome's vast empire required strong leadership to survive. Yet, beginning in the 3rd century CE, the empire was thrown into a whirlwind of political instability. Instead of steady rulers guiding Rome through its challenges, the throne became a dangerous prize, one claimed not by merit or wisdom but often by the sword. Between the years 235 and 284 CE, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of its own internal chaos. In just 50 years, Rome saw more than 24 emperors rise and fall, many ruling only months before being assassinated or overthrown by their own soldiers. Loyalty to Rome as a whole weakened, while loyalty to local generals or regional leaders grew stronger. The Praetorian Guard, once the emperor's protectors, turned into kingmakers, selling the throne to the highest bidder. In 193 CE, they even auctioned off the empire, declaring that whoever offered the largest payment to the soldiers would be crowned emperor. Such corruption undermined the very dignity of imperial power and set a dangerous precedent. Emperors were no longer chosen for vision or leadership, but for their ability to pay and please the army. Civil wars erupted as rival claimants fought for control. Each time legions clashed against legions, Rome weakened itself further. Valuable resources were wasted not defending the empire from external threats, but spilling Roman blood against Roman blood. Provinces that once flourished with trade and agriculture were ravaged by the marching armies of competing generals. While Rome battled itself, its enemies pressed harder at the frontiers. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube tested the empire's defenses, raiding villages and destroying crops. In the east, the powerful Persian Sassanid Empire challenged Rome for dominance, defeating legions and even capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation the empire would never forget. The endless cycle of assassinations, usurpations, and civil wars eroded the stability that had once made Rome strong. Citizens who once saw the emperor as a protector now viewed him as a temporary figure, unlikely to last. Provinces grew restless, sensing weakness at the heart of the empire. Local leaders began to act with greater independence, and the bonds tying distant lands to Rome started to loosen. Economically, the political chaos made matters worse. Each new emperor tried to buy loyalty by minting more coins, flooding the economy with cheapened currency. Inflation soared, and ordinary Romans found their savings worthless. Farmers abandoned their lands, unable to pay taxes, and trade networks faltered. The great Roman market system, once the lifeblood of the Mediterranean, began to shrink. This was no longer the empire of Augustus or Trajan, united and stable under powerful leadership. Rome had become a fractured, uncertain state where power changed hands with alarming speed. The very heart of Roman governance, the ability to project authority across vast lands, was breaking down. Though some emperors tried to restore order, their efforts often came too late, or were undone by their assassins. Stability returned briefly under Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, but the damage of decades of turmoil had already weakened the empire's foundation. The faith of the people in Rome's eternity had been shaken. The crisis of leadership showed the empire's greatest vulnerability, not its enemies beyond the borders but its inability to govern itself. Rome could withstand barbarian raids, plagues, and natural disasters, but when its rulers failed, the empire hollowed itself from within. The seeds of collapse had been sown not only in corruption and greed, but in blood spilled by Romans against Romans. The eternal city's decline had truly begun. If political chaos weakened Rome's stability, economic troubles ate away at its very survival. The grandeur of the empire, its vast armies, colossal monuments, and intricate bureaucracy, came at a heavy price. At first, Rome's wealth poured in from conquest: gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, slaves from Gaul, and tribute from defeated kingdoms. But by the 3rd century CE, expansion had slowed. The empire no longer grew richer from new conquests, yet its costs continued to climb. The Roman military machine consumed staggering resources. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be paid, fed, and equipped, guarding borders that stretched for thousands of miles. As threats multiplied along the Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontiers, emperors increased the size of the army. To meet these demands, taxes soared. Farmers were expected to deliver grain and livestock, while landowners were squeezed for coin. The wealthy found ways to evade taxes, while the poor bore the crushing burden. As the tax net widened, small farmers began abandoning their land. Many could not keep up with payments, nor could they compete with the massive estates of the elite, who relied on slave labor. Abandoned fields reduced food production, leading to shortages and driving prices higher. Hunger and discontent spread, and the once self-sustaining countryside began to collapse. Currency devaluation only deepened the crisis. To pay the army and fund public works, emperors minted coins with less silver and gold, replacing precious metals with cheaper alloys. This triggered inflation. Ordinary citizens found that money bought less and less, and trade became unstable. Merchants raised prices, hoarded goods, or abandoned long-distance commerce altogether. Rome's famed trade routes, once alive with ships and caravans, slowed to a trickle. Urban life suffered as well. The great cities of the empire, which had once thrived on imported grain and vibrant trade, began to decline. Public entertainment, gladiator games, chariot races, and lavish festivals became harder to fund. Aqueducts and roads fell into disrepair, as there was less revenue to maintain them. The sense of Roman prosperity, which had dazzled the world, dimmed year by year. The empire's dependence on slave labor also contributed to its struggles. For centuries, conquest had supplied Rome with a steady flow of enslaved workers. But as expansion slowed, so too did the supply of slaves. Estates and workshops that relied on forced labor faced shortages, and productivity declined. The system that had once powered Roman agriculture and industry now faltered. Meanwhile, corruption spread through the tax system and bureaucracy. Officials often enriched themselves while squeezing the population even harder. Ordinary Romans came to see the empire not as a protector, but as a predator, an oppressive force that demanded endless payments while giving little in return. Loyalty to Rome eroded, not only among soldiers and elites, but among common people who no longer saw their future tied to the empire's fate. Some emperors attempted reforms. Diocletian, for example, issued strict laws to freeze prices and bind farmers to their land, trying to stop the economic freefall. But these measures often created resentment and hardship, forcing people into semi-servile conditions. The Roman dream of citizenship and prosperity was replaced by the grim reality of survival under a crumbling system. The economic troubles of Rome did not come from a single disaster, but from a slow unraveling of systems that had once worked in harmony. Taxes drained the poor, inflation eroded wealth, agriculture declined, trade collapsed, and corruption rotted governance. The empire that had once been the richest state in the ancient world was now struggling to feed itself. Rome's economy, once the engine of its greatness, had become the weight dragging it down. For centuries, the strength of Rome's legions had kept invaders at bay. The Rhine and Danube rivers marked the northern frontier, defended by a network of forts, watchtowers, and garrisons. Beyond these borders lived the peoples Rome called barbarians, Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Alemanni, as well as nomadic groups like the Huns. To the Romans, these outsiders were uncivilized, but in truth they were resilient, adaptive, and growing stronger. At first, barbarian incursions were little more than raids, bands of warriors crossing into Roman territory to steal livestock, plunder villages, or capture slaves. Rome's military superiority usually crushed such invasions. But over time the pressure increased. Climate changes and population growth pushed tribes closer to Roman borders. Entire nations, not just raiding parties, began seeking land and safety within the empire's frontiers. The most dramatic shift came with the arrival of the Huns in the late 4th century. Fierce horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns swept into Eastern Europe with terrifying speed, displacing entire tribes before them. The Goths, fleeing the Huns, begged for refuge inside the empire. In 376 CE, Emperor Valens allowed thousands of Gothic refugees to cross the Danube into Roman lands. But corruption and mistreatment by Roman officials soon drove them to revolt. The result was disaster. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths annihilated a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. This was more than just a defeat, it was a shockwave through the empire. Never before had Rome suffered such a devastating loss to a barbarian enemy on its own soil. It revealed that the legions, once invincible, could be broken. From that point on, Rome faced constant pressure. The Visigoths under Alaric would later march into Italy itself, sacking the city of Rome in 410 CE, a moment that stunned the ancient world. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, seizing Carthage and cutting off one of Rome's most vital sources of grain. The Franks pushed deeper into Gaul, while the Saxons raided Britain's coasts. The borders that had once been lines of defense became porous. Rome tried to adapt by recruiting barbarian tribes into its own army. Many Germans served as mercenaries or allies, fighting under Roman banners. Yet this strategy carried risks. These federated troops were often loyal to their own leaders rather than to the empire. In time, entire Roman armies were composed more of non-Romans than citizens, shifting the balance of power within the empire itself. For ordinary Romans living near the borders, life became increasingly dangerous. Farms and villages were abandoned after repeated invasions. Refugees streamed into the safer heartlands, straining resources even further. The sense of security that had once defined Roman citizenship was gone. The empire, once a shield, was now a fragile wall against chaos. These barbarian pressures were not just military, they were also cultural. As tribes settled within the empire, they brought their own customs, languages, and identities. Rome was no longer a purely Roman world. It became a patchwork of peoples, some loyal, some hostile, many simply seeking survival. This transformation would eventually reshape Europe itself, but for Rome, it was a fatal weakening. What began as raids became migrations. What began as mercenaries became conquerors. And what began as borders became open gates. Rome had once been the master of its world, but now it was reacting, retreating, and negotiating from weakness. The barbarians were no longer just enemies at the gates. They were inside Rome itself. As Rome's challenges grew, political instability, economic decline, and external threats, its sheer size became a weakness. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the deserts of Syria, from the misty hills of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Governing such a vast territory with slow communication, fragile roads, and constant military demands became nearly impossible. The solution, devised by Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century CE, was to divide the empire. In 285 CE, Diocletian split Roman authority between two rulers, one governing the Western Empire, the other the Eastern. This was later formalized into the Tetrarchy with two senior emperors, Augusti, and two junior emperors, Caesars, sharing responsibility for different regions. The idea was practical. Smaller units of rule could respond more quickly to crises. Yet while it bought time, it also planted seeds of division. The East, centered on the wealthy provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, flourished. Its cities were prosperous, its trade routes secure, and its agriculture productive. When Constantine the Great rose to power in the early 4th century, he recognized this strength and founded a new capital in 330 CE. Constantinople, built on the site of Byzantium. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia, Constantinople became a hub of commerce, culture, and defense. The Western Empire, by contrast, struggled. It was poorer, more rural, and more vulnerable to barbarian invasions. Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain lacked the wealth of the East, and their defenses were harder to maintain. The West relied heavily on grain from North Africa and had fewer natural resources to sustain its armies and infrastructure. The growing imbalance between East and West became starkly visible. While Constantinople thrived with strong walls and bustling markets, Rome itself began to decay. Once the beating heart of an empire, Rome was increasingly irrelevant to political power. Emperors rarely resided there. Instead, they ruled from cities closer to the frontiers or from Constantinople itself. The symbolism was striking. The eternal city of Rome was no longer the center of the Roman world. This division also weakened unity. Instead of working together, emperors of East and West sometimes competed for power. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for the purple, draining resources that should have gone toward defending against external threats. Even when they cooperated, their priorities were different. The East focused on trade and diplomacy with Persia, while the West fought desperately to repel Germanic tribes. When crises struck, the East often saved itself first. For example, when the Visigoths invaded Italy, the Eastern Empire gave limited support, preferring to protect its own wealth and borders. Gradually, the West became expendable, a weaker partner left to face the brunt of invasions alone. By the 5th century CE, this imbalance became fatal. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, remained strong for centuries, preserving Roman traditions and flourishing in its own right. The Western Empire, however, was left isolated, weakened, and exposed. The division that had once been a solution became a symbol of Rome's decline. Instead of one united empire standing tall, there were now two worlds. One rich, powerful, and enduring in the East, the other fragile and collapsing in the West. The Roman Empire had not yet fallen, but its foundation was cracked. And through those cracks, history itself would break apart. For nearly 800 years, Rome had stood untouchable. Even as provinces rose and fell, even as emperors were assassinated and armies defeated, the city itself, the eternal city, remained a symbol of stability and power. To Romans and foreigners alike, it seemed inconceivable that enemies could ever breach its walls. Yet in the early 5th century that illusion shattered. The Visigoths, once refugees within the empire, had become a formidable force under their leader Alaric I. After years of mistreatment and broken promises by Roman authorities, the Goths turned from reluctant allies into bitter enemies. They marched through the Balkans into Greece and eventually into Italy itself. Rome, long accustomed to security, suddenly faced a threat it had not seen since Hannibal centuries earlier. In 410 CE, Alaric and his army surrounded Rome. The city was weakened by famine, internal strife, and political disarray. Negotiations dragged on, but the Romans could not meet Alaric's demands. On a fateful August night, the Visigoths broke through the gates. For 3 days Rome was looted. Homes were plundered, treasures seized, and citizens terrorized. Though the destruction was not total, churches were spared and much of the population survived. The psychological impact was devastating. The sack of Rome echoed across the ancient world like thunder. Pagans argued that the gods had abandoned the city because Rome had turned to Christianity. Christians defended the faith, claiming that earthly cities could fall but the city of God was eternal, a theme later immortalized by Augustine of Hippo in his writings. Either way, the sense of invincibility was gone. Rome was no longer untouchable. Even more alarming was what the sack symbolized. The empire could no longer protect its heart. The city that had once ruled the Mediterranean was now at the mercy of tribes it once dismissed as barbarians. Foreign armies roamed freely on Italian soil, and the emperor, residing not in Rome but in the safer city of Ravenna, seemed powerless to act. The sack of 410 was not the last humiliation. In 455 CE, the Vandals, having established a powerful kingdom in North Africa, launched a naval expedition and sacked Rome again. This time they stripped the city of its wealth more thoroughly, carrying off treasures that had symbolized Roman glory for centuries. From this act comes the very word vandalism. To the Roman people, these disasters were not just military defeats, they were spiritual wounds. Rome had been the eternal city, the shining center of civilization, the embodiment of empire. Now it was exposed as fragile, its aura of supremacy shattered. The loss of prestige accelerated the empire's decline. Provinces saw that Rome could no longer guarantee their safety and began drifting further from imperial authority. Local leaders and barbarian generals filled the power vacuum, carving out their own domains while the empire shrank. What once had been unthinkable had become reality. Rome was just another city, vulnerable and plundered. The sack of Rome marked not the final fall, but the point of no return. After centuries of greatness, the empire's decline was now undeniable. And still worse was to come. The emperors of the West, weak and overshadowed by their generals, struggled to maintain even the semblance of control. Soon, the very office of emperor itself would vanish into history. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was but a shadow of its former self. Provinces that had once filled Rome's coffers with grain, gold, and manpower were slipping away one by one. Britain was abandoned, Gaul fell under the sway of Franks and Visigoths, Spain broke apart, and North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals. Without Africa's grain, the Western Empire starved. Without its taxes, the treasury was empty. Without unity, the army collapsed. At the same time, the emperors of the West had become little more than figureheads. Real power often lay in the hands of generals, many of them of barbarian origin. These men, commanding mercenary armies, held the empire hostage. Loyalty was fleeting and betrayal was constant. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession, some reigning only months before being deposed or murdered. The dignity of the imperial office, once commanding fear and awe, was reduced to a pawn in the struggles of ambitious warlords. One of the greatest threats came from the east, the Huns, led by the fearsome Attila. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila terrorized both east and west, invading the Balkans, raiding Gaul, and even threatening Italy itself. In 452 CE, Attila marched into the Po Valley, and Rome trembled once again. Though Attila turned back, whether due to famine, disease, or negotiation, the mere fact that he approached Rome underscored its helplessness. The empire could no longer defend even its homeland without luck and diplomacy. After Attila's death, the Huns faded, but the Western Empire did not recover. It was too fractured, too poor, and too weak. The Eastern Empire, stronger and wealthier, had little interest in saving its Western counterpart. Constantinople remained secure behind its massive walls, a city destined to outlast Rome by 1,000 years. The final act of the Western Empire came in 476 CE. The last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was little more than a puppet of the Germanic general Odoacer. In September of that year, Odoacer deposed Romulus and declared himself ruler of Italy. He did not bother to claim the title of emperor, instead sending the imperial insignia to Constantinople. To the Romans, it may have seemed just another transfer of power in a long line of upheavals. But historians later marked this as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. It was a quiet death. There was no dramatic battle, no burning of Rome, no sudden collapse. Instead, the empire had rotted from within, economically drained, militarily exhausted, and politically fractured. When the final blow came, it fell like a whisper rather than a roar. Yet the fall of the West was not the end of Rome's story. The Eastern Empire, or Byzantium, endured, preserving Roman law, culture, and identity for centuries more. In the West, the fragments of Rome lived on in the kingdoms of Goths, Franks, and Lombards, who borrowed Roman traditions even as they built their own. The dream of Rome did not die, it transformed. But in 476 CE, for the first time in centuries, the Mediterranean world woke to a new reality. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer the master of an empire. Though the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, Rome itself did not truly die. Its spirit, its culture, and its legacy continued to shape the world for centuries, and in many ways still does today. The collapse of political power was only one chapter. the story of Rome's influence was far from over. First, the Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, carried the torch of Rome. Constantinople became the new Rome, a thriving capital that endured invasions, plagues, and centuries of turmoil. For 1,000 years after the fall of the West, the Byzantines preserved Roman law, administration, and architecture. Their scholars copied ancient texts, safeguarding the wisdom of Greece and Rome for future generations. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century, would later inspire the legal systems of Europe and beyond. In the West, though the empire vanished, its foundations endured. The Latin language evolved into the Romance tongues, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, spoken by millions today. Roman engineering left behind aqueducts, roads, bridges, and amphitheaters that still stand as marvels of ingenuity. Roman law, Roman architecture, and even the concept of a republic continued to shape new societies. The Christian Church, which had grown within the empire, became the most enduring institution of the post-Roman West. Centered in Rome, the papacy preserved a sense of continuity with the old empire. Cathedrals rose where temples once stood, and bishops wielded power once reserved for governors. Christianity, spread across the empire's roads and provinces, became Rome's greatest gift to the Western world, outlasting the empire itself. Even in politics, the idea of Rome lived on. Medieval kings and emperors sought legitimacy by claiming connection to Rome. In 800 CE, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans, reviving the title in the West as the Holy Roman Empire. Centuries later, the Russian Tsars would call Moscow the Third Rome, claiming succession to its eternal authority. The name of Rome was a symbol of ultimate power. The fall of the Roman Empire also reshaped Europe in profound ways. With centralized authority gone, new kingdoms emerged, Germanic, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, laying the groundwork for modern nations. The medieval world was born from the ashes of Rome. Though historians once called it a dark age, it was also a period of transformation, where Rome's memory mixed with new cultures to forge the Europe we know today. To this day, Rome's shadow lingers. Democracies look to the Roman Republic as inspiration for senates and constitutions. Modern architecture borrows the arches, domes, and columns perfected by Roman builders. The calendar we follow, the alphabet we use, and the legal rights we uphold all trace their roots to Rome. Thus, while the empire itself crumbled, Rome achieved a different kind of immortality. Its armies and emperors may be gone, but its ideas, innovations, and institutions became the bedrock of Western civilization. In many ways, Rome did not fall at all. It transformed, dispersing its legacy across the world. The Roman Empire reminds us that even the greatest powers can fade, yet also that true greatness lies not only in conquest, but in the endurance of culture, law, and ideas. And so, though the empire ended in 476 CE, Rome lives on, in language, in law, in faith, and in the very fabric of our world.